Hello. So let's discuss a little bit of the changes we see with the 1970s, specifically with regard to the counterculture, some changes we see in popular culture as well. This lecture is called Revolution Blues, and this term comes from a song by Neil Young on his classic On the Beach, his best record, in my opinion. It's highly recommended. Now, during this time, American culture, its changes. Again, we see a change from hope and optimism to disillusionment and disappointment. The failed promise of the 1960s gives way to unease from a focus on society as a whole and fixing its problems to an inward-looking nation, one looking to better understand itself and its own faults. We have consciousness-raising sessions, self-improvement seminars, cults, the like. We'll get to that in a little bit. One little bit that I do want to mention, especially as we see toward the end of the 1960s, is kind of a movement of the intellectual community from the East Coast to the West Coast. Now, New York would still maintain a strong folk culture. We will later see American punk rock develop there and in Detroit. Hardcore would start up in Washington, D.C. It would be its own monster. But the previous decade, there is an exodus of many important artists. Stephen Stills, Joni Mitchell, John Phillips, numerous others would find their way to the winding hills of Laurel Canyon, creating a community of musical artists that forged substantial change. It is here where the Mamas and Papas would find their way to the top, where Crosby, Stills, and Nash would initially come together. It's here where you see Jim Morrison riding his bike around half naked at any hour of the day. It is in Laurel Canyon where Eric Clapton would be blown away by a new folk guitarist named Joni Mitchell. California had already been a magnet to many Americans seeking a better life. I mean, you could go back to the 19th century, the gold rush, of course, earlier in the 20th century with the Great Depression. Many people moved west looking for opportunity. Now it teamed with a new type of opportunity. The main themes of this music would also represent something of a change, with nature and peace and love more pronounced. There is a two-part documentary entitled Laurel Canyon that I highly recommend for anybody who wants to learn more about this community, how it developed, and the larger impact it made. So we see this shift from the East Coast to the West Coast. Life is different in the West. People focus on different goals and realities. It's more relaxed. It's more laid back. Unfortunately, though, this move from the 1960s to the 1970s also represents something of a downturn for the counterculture. We see some disillusionment among many who had only held hope a decade before. Vietnam dragged on. Watergate's on the horizon. Economic issues, including stagflation and the energy crisis, are crippling the country. All the change that was sought in the 1960s seemed to just flutter away. Civil rights seems to have peaked. Many still felt marginalized, though. Camelot of a charismatic John Kennedy morphed into a stodgy, self-absorbed LBJ and Richard Nixon. The Great Society promised an end to poverty and racial discrimination, yet each grew in some ways. The draft was taking young men to war who did not want to participate, breaking up families that were simply seeking to survive to the next day. Simply put, the hope and promise of the 1960s gave way to pessimism, to a feeling of hopelessness. Two horrendous incidents at the beginning, well, I should say in May of 1970, would only exacerbate these tensions and, in some ways, lead to more radicalism among some. We'll start with Kent State. Now, prior to these shootings, SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, were actively involved in the anti-war movement at Kent State. It was a very active chapter. On May 1st, SDS leads a response to Nixon's announcement that he is attacking Cambodia. Student protests grow. The ROTC building is attacked. Fires are set around the building. Leroy Satrum, who is the mayor, requests the National Guard be sent to town to maintain order. 2 days later, on May 3rd, about 1,000 National Guardsmen are sent to occupy the campus. By 10 p.m. that night, the ROTC building is found fully ablaze. Ohio Governor James Rhodes travels to Kent, and he states, quote, "They are the worst type of people we harbor in America. They are worse than the communists. We're going to eradicate the problem." That did not age well. The next day, May 4th, activism proceeds. Students are notified that rallies are prohibited while National Guardsmen occupy the campus, but of course, the students continue to protest. Around noon on that day, about 2,000 people gather at Kent Commons in protest of the Guard occupation. Dispersal is ordered, but the taunting of Guardsmen only intensifies. Students begin throwing rocks, which leads to tear gas from the Guardsmen. The Guardsmen then chase the students to the football field. There is a short standoff. Rocks again are thrown by students. Guardsmen kneel. They take aim, but they do not shoot. After this, the troops begin marching in retreat. Once they reach Blanket Hill, Troop G turns and fires on the students. There were claims of sniper fire against the guardsmen. In 13 seconds, a total of 67 bullets are fired, 9 people are wounded, 4 are dead. This will also lead Neil Young to write the song Ohio, which will then be recorded by Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Recorded and put out within a few days. It is one of the great songs of the 1960s, even if it was written and recorded in 1970. One of the really great anti-Vietnam songs as well. Fortunate Son by Creedence, of course, is right up there, but Ohio really captures quite a bit. And I highly recommend giving a listen to that song after you're done with this video lecture. So again, 9 people are wounded, 4 are dead. Almost 500 colleges shut down or are disrupted by protests over the shootings. Eventually, a grand jury indicts 8 of the guardsmen. Charges are dismissed for a lack of evidence. And I would ask, is this the end of the 60s? One could look at Altamont as the end of the 60s. One could even look at Watergate as the end of the 60s. Maybe you look at the Chicago Democratic National Convention as the end of the 60s. The Kent State shootings very well could be the end of the 60s. 10 days later, May 14th, at Jackson State. Now, this is a school attended mostly by African Americans that had gone through its share of civil rights protests. Whites in town often clashed with black students, and 1970 was no different. But many Jackson State students did not subscribe to civil disobedience. They were more militant. While students from nearby schools like Tougaloo College held sit-ins, Jackson State students took more action. In the spring of 1970, in early May, a popular female student was injured by a white motorist as she attempted to cross Lynch Street, which was the main thoroughfare in town. Many felt that this was an intentional act running into her. Racial unrest leads to another spring riot in the town. African American students began throwing rocks and bottles at white motorists who were using Lynch Street. This, of course, these tensions would be exacerbated by rumors that the Fayette, Mississippi mayor Charles Evers, who's the brother of Medgar Evers, and his wife had been killed. Rioting commences on Lynch Street. The ROTC building is set on fire. A bonfire is created on campus. Firemen come to put out the blaze. They are harassed by students. Police march toward a women's dormitory, face about 100 students who set their own line. One of the students throws a bottle which breaks. The police open fire. Now, there were reports that someone had fired a gun at the police from the dorm. 2 news reporters confirmed this claim. The police would shoot for about 30 seconds. A 17-year-old high school student named James Earl Green was walking home from work and he just stopped by to watch the riot. He would be slain, as would 21-year-old Philip Lafayette Gibbs. 15 others would be wounded. Even today, the dormitory has bullet holes showing the many shots taken by the police. Now, the grand jury refuses to indict the officers. A U.S. Court of Appeals concludes the officers overreacted, but they could not be held liable for the deaths. Within 11 days, you have 6 college students killed by the authorities for protesting. Was it a peaceful protest? Maybe not. Did it justify shooting? Political radicalism is ongoing as well. I discussed the Weather Underground in a different video lecture. They worked their way well into the 1970s, bombing government buildings, killing innocent people. They would account for up to 45 bombings in 1975 alone. Other anti-war activists would carry out bombings at Fresno State College, the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and City Hall in Portland, Oregon. Black Panthers themselves would carry out 24 bombings, assaults, and hijacking. While they were definitely being attacked by the police as well. Check out the story of Fred Hampton if you get a chance. In 1970, Omaha, we have the booby trap bombing of police officer Larry P. Menard by 2 Black Panthers named Edward Poindexter and David Rice. We later have the bombing of LaGuardia Airport in New York, which leads to 11 deaths and scores injured. This is only one of many such incidents, and this is also pervasive in Europe. Now this, when you get to the LaGuardia Airport bombing, gets to a larger issue, which is beginning to earn its name, and that is terror. Now, terrorism had existed prior, but it really ramped up in the 1970s, particularly with public demonstrations and captures of innocents. In 1970, for example, Palestinian activists would hijack 5 planes and make demands. This would be ongoing throughout the 1970s and continue into later decades as well. Arguably, the most infamous of these terror attacks occurred at the 1972 Munich Games by a Palestinian terror group called Black September. 8 terrorists killed 2 members of the Israeli Olympic team before taking 9 others hostage. Now, this is already a nervous time. This was the first Olympics held in Germany since World War II, and some of the members of the Israeli team had lost family members in the Holocaust. So it was a very uncomfortable moment anyway. Terrorists demanded the release of 234 prisoners that they claimed were political prisoners. Israel refused, as they did not negotiate with terrorists. Pardon me. Eventually, there was a confrontation at the airport. German officials tried to rescue the hostages. The terrorists realized it was a trap. They would kill all the remaining hostages. If you have seen the video of Jim McKay, who's a famous sports announcer, saying, they're all gone. They're all gone. They had all been killed by these terrorists. German officials would kill 5 of the terrorists, take the other 3 into custody. A few months later, other Black September members hijacked a plane and demanded the release of those 3 remaining prisoners. Germany acquiesced and released the prisoners against the wishes of Israel. Israel would exact its own revenge through Operation Wrath of God. There is an excellent documentary on the hostage taking at Munich entitled One Day in September. It is quite disturbing with some of the footage, so please be aware, but it is an amazing documentary and really tells the story quite well. We also see various acts of terrorism against Americans overseas and in the States, bombings, shootings, hijackings of planes, oftentimes by Palestinian activists. Middle East tensions rise, partially due to our support of Israel, ergo the Palestinians attacking us, which contributes to an oil embargo, leading to long lines at the gas pump. We have other economic issues, right? Inflation reaches 20% during the decade. Unemployment reaches 10%. Many Americans turn to drugs as a form of escape. The discotheque becomes popular as people seek to dance away their personal problems. If you've seen the movie Saturday Night Fever, this really captures that moment. Promiscuity increases, as does the divorce rate, and concomitantly, poverty and crime. This would help push for a new religious revival, one that would be partially responsible for the rise of Reagan, but would also change the zeitgeist for the decade of the 1980s. Now, looking at all this, again, some find ways to escape, whether that be drugs, the discotheque, or some of the other things we'll talk about here in a moment. But for others, this leads again to disappointment. The hope of the previous decade, all the optimism that they had, and things only get worse, significantly worse in the 1970s. In the U.S., there are incessant criticisms of Nixon and his American leadership, what Spiro Agnew would once call the nattering nabobs of negativism. Say what you will about Agnew, he had some pretty clever phrasing. We also have one of the larger episodes of corruption by an American political leader, Watergate. How did Americans deal with all this? There's fallout from LBJ and his lies, the festering quagmire of Vietnam, Watergate, growing economic problems which challenged American families in new ways, continuing clashes between minority groups and the government. Beyond African Americans, we see this with the American Indian movement. We also see it with what was called the Brown Power movement. The utopia that many believed was coming was simply not meant to be. So while some escaped through drugs and discos, but this is when we see a turn inward of the American people. Again, rather than direct efforts toward entire communities or societies, toward changing the country from the bottom up, people began to focus on themselves and how they could improve internally. Now, Bob Dylan, you've heard me speak about him. He is the voice of his generation in the 1960s, right? And he is in the 70s as well. And in this decade, he releases his classic Blood on the Tracks, which is about a breakup. He's looking inward. He also releases 3 specifically religious albums. Again, he's looking for some kind of hope. He's looking for answers. He's looking for some type of idea of how to deal with these issues. He's not going after authority. He's not calling for massive change. Again, he's looking inward to try to make sense of life and himself. Many others would do the same, whether they were rock stars or not. Self-help and self-actualization came in many forms. Marriage Encounters, for example, which, just as it sounds, was about helping people work on their marriage. And this was very popular in the 70s and 80s, and part of it was a lot of these people, they said they didn't have problems with their marriage. They just wanted to better themselves. You have EST, or the Erhard Seminars training, which was part of what was called the Human Potential Movement. New Age centers, such as the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, provide courses in transcendental meditation, yoga, etc. And there are a variety of cults. As the decade rolled on, we see more unease, we see unrest, we see unhappiness. In the United States, we had the Manson family. I won't get into the particulars of their attacks, but you'd be surprised to know how much it was connected with the music scene. Dennis Wilson, John Phillips, even Stephen Stills. But Neil Young thought that Charles Manson was a great songwriter. Eek. But Manson, of course, will take action. That scares the heck out of many Americans. We also see Jonestown. If you're familiar, Jim Jones has this large cult. Takes to Guyana, and they all commit mass suicide. These are people searching for something to make sense to them, to make sense of the world that they live in. And in doing so, they gave up their entire individuality and their beings. They often gave up all their money. They gave up contacting their families. Again, they're looking personally, what's often called the me decade. They're trying to find out how to improve themselves. In general, we see a rise of these types in smaller cults during the time for the same reason. Again, there's protection afforded in these types of organizations. Many insecure people are taken advantage of in this way. They give up their life savings and any contact with their family simply to have some of this peace. Communes also pop up as a form of escape, much not nearly as bad as many of these cults, of course. Now, later in the decade, we see a new voice for youth emerge, and you see, again, the counterculture in the 60s, hippies, right, and a lot of like the San Francisco acid rock sound. In the 70s, this counterculture kind of morphs into punk music. And again, this is a reaction against the stale 1970s, against authority issues. Several bands emerge, some of the better ones, X from California, the Stooges from Detroit, Minor Threat, Bad Brains from Washington, D.C., the Ramones from New York City. Also from Detroit would be MC5, their classic record, Kick Out the Jams, Mother. All right, check it out. Regional sounds, all these punk and hardcore kind of subgenres are different. The West Coast has a different sound from the East Coast, for example. You have hardcore in Washington, D.C., whereas you have punk rock, a little bit more affable, more fun, if you will, on the West Coast. You have Detroit, which is edgy. It's heavy. It's loud. It's almost like perfectly encapsulates Detroit, right? You could almost see some of this hardcore in Detroit almost being very similar to heavy metal later. And of course, you have English punk, like The Clash. It develops in a different way. Now, punk rock is partially created to combat hippie music. It's created to combat popular music, and it is certainly created to combat disco. Punk rockers hated disco. Now, this is a reaction against the norm, against the times, against the establishment. Again, it reflects a continuing and growing anger at this lost promise. This sound would grow stronger and more political in the 1980s as it combated Ronald Reagan, who was a truly conservative president. Now, before we wrap things up, I do want to talk a little bit about popular culture as it spreads out a bit. So you have the counterculture in the 60s, which develops. You have punk rock that develops in the 1970s, and in the 90s you have what's called alternative or indie music. But even popular culture in the 1970s begins to spread out. Folks found ways to cope and learn more about themselves. They sought some escape. For many, this included going to the discotheque, as I mentioned. It included drinking. It included dancing the night away. We see the origins, though, of movie blockbusters like Godfathers, Jaws, Star Wars. Jaws is the greatest movie of all time, which allowed an opportunity to get away from the daunting problems facing Americans. But we also see efforts at taking on new issues in some ways, especially with popular culture, and I would specifically mention television. In 1970, Mary Tyler Moore premieres, the Mary Tyler Moore Show premieres, and it is the first television show that's about a woman who's not just looking to get married. She's not out there looking for a husband. She's an independent professional woman who lives on her own, and that's what the show is about. To us today, so what? Revolutionary in 1970. Good Times reflected the challenges of living in the Chicago projects as a working-class African-American family, and it tackled real issues. The Jeffersons showed a professional African-American business owner succeeding in Manhattan, developing his own independence, getting wealthy off his own labor. Chico and the Man followed a young Mexican-American man and his interactions with the world. Welcome Back, Kotter celebrated the diversity in New York City high schools. All in the Family poked fun at racism and backwardness. Mary Hartman showed the folly of social prescriptions on women. One Day at a Time showed a single mom raising two teenage daughters and the problems that they encountered on a daily basis. Very realistic. They were all shoved in this tiny apartment, right? And she's got this guy that's always trying to get together with her. And she's like, no, the most important thing for me is taking care of my children and being an independent professional woman. MASH was about the Korean War, right? But make no mistake, it was focused on the absurdity of war in general. And if you know this, the movie, of course, comes out in the late 60s, but the TV show begins in the early 70s while Vietnam is going on. And that is what this show is about, how war impacts even those who do not list or fight. In short, television as a cultural device was opening up in new ways. More people were represented. This is arguably one of the greatest impacts in the 1960s. Even if there were failures along the way and things were still not perfect and there was lost hope, we become a more open, a more tolerant society that begins to truly celebrate its diversity and multiculturalism. This is one reason the decade of the 1960s is so important, as it permanently changed our nation in many ways, starting with a new recognition and acceptance of our varied lives as Americans.